Throughout my career, I've provided care in numerous hospitals and medical facilities, gaining experience in different healthcare settings. Before transitioning to my current role, I spent some time working at Westfield Geriatric Center, a facility about a half-hour drive from my home. Given my background in caring for elderly patients, I felt well prepared for the job. However, an unsettling experience during my short tenure there still lingers in my mind. On what turned out to be my second-to-last shift, I had no idea the events of that night would ultimately lead me to resign. I was scheduled for an overnight shift, a grueling rotation that had left me utterly exhausted after working several back-to-back nights. My assignment placed me in the Alzheimer's ward, where patients often required more emotional support than medical intervention. One patient in particular stood out that night. Her name was Mia. This was my first time caring for her, and she was noticeably restless. Mia kept talking about voices she heard, and a man in black who stood silently in the corner of her room. The other patient in her shared room, an elderly woman named Ruth, had asked for the curtain to be drawn between their beds earlier in the evening to avoid Mia's outbursts. Ruth was sweet but quiet and forgetful, smiling at me now and then without saying much. By 11 p.m., most of the ward had settled into a peaceful sleep, except for Mia. Every time I entered her room, she looked genuinely frightened. She insisted the man in black was staring at her, refusing to leave the corner of her room. Her fear was infectious. Though I knew her condition likely explained her behavior, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that crept over me. I did my best to comfort her, holding her hands and guiding her through breathing exercises. I assured her that she wasn't alone and reminded her to call me if she needed anything. After a while, Mia seemed to relax, and when I checked on her again later, she was asleep. The hours dragged on after that. Night shifts have a way of stretching time, especially in the quiet hours after midnight. Around 1 a.m., I was in the linen room, restocking my cart. The room was small, and the silence was thick, broken only by the faint rustling of linens as I worked. That's when I heard it. A soft noise, like a shuffle, coming from the room. The door was closed, and I knew I was alone, yet the sound persisted. I froze, glancing around, but saw nothing. Convinced I was imagining things, I resumed my task, only to feel a sudden, firm pressure on my shoulder. I gasped and spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. The room was empty. My hands were shaking as I peeked out into the hallway, but it was silent and still. No other nurses were nearby. Trying to shake off the incident, I returned to my work. When my cart was finally full, I turned to leave and froze. Standing just outside the linen room door, peering in through the small glass window, was a man dressed in black. He was smiling, a wide, unnerving grin that sent chills down my spine. I screamed, dropping to the floor as panic overtook me. My screams echoed through the ward, loud enough to wake the patients. When I looked back toward the door, the man was gone. Seconds later, the door burst open and another nurse, Maria, rushed in. She helped me to my feet, her face full of concern. "Are you okay? What happened?" she asked. I stammered, asking if she'd seen the man in black. Her expression turned confused. "What man? There's no one here." Maria and I checked the ward together, peering into every room and hallway. There was no sign of anyone matching the description. The patients were either asleep or groggy from being woken by my screams. When we arrived at Mia's room, she was awake, trembling beneath the dim glow of the bedside lamp. Her wide, fearful eyes met mine as she whispered, "He's here. The voices. I warned you. He's coming." Her words broke into desperate sobs as she pointed toward the same dark corner she had fixated on before. I gently asked her to describe the figure, but instead of answering, she stared at me with unnerving intensity. "You've seen him, haven't you?" she murmured. A chill ran down my spine. For weeks, the memory clung to me. I had never experienced hallucinations, nor had I ever struggled with my mental health. While I understood the toll of exhaustion, this felt like something else entirely. the unseen hand gripping my shoulder, the sinister smile I thought I saw, and Mia's chilling certainty. It all felt too real. Since then, I've avoided working in Alzheimer's wards, convincing myself it was an isolated incident. Yet, even now, the memory refuses to fade. While living in coastal Georgia, I fell severely ill with bacterial meningitis. As far as I knew, there had been no reported outbreaks in the area, and to this day I have no idea how I contracted it. The symptoms crept in gradually before escalating into something unbearable. Piercing headaches, confusion, nausea, relentless drowsiness, and a total loss of appetite. When the hallucinations started, I realized I was in serious trouble. One afternoon, I lay in bed, feverish and drained, while my husband Daniel was at work. The house was completely still until I heard it. A child's voice drifted up from downstairs, calling, "Mom." My stomach turned. Daniel and I didn't have children. A cold wave of fear washed over me as I forced myself out of bed, gripping the wall to stay upright. Every step sent sharp pains through my skull. From the top of the stairs, I called out Daniel's name, knowing he wouldn't answer, but desperate for some logical explanation. Silence. My body, weak from illness, gave in to exhaustion, and I staggered back to bed, too drained to question what I had just heard. Moments later, I heard another voice, clear as day. "Hello," it called from downstairs. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and called Jack. In a panic, I told him about the voices and how terrified I was. "I think I'm hallucinating," I said through tears. Hearing the distress in my voice, Jack left work early and insisted on taking me to the hospital. While waiting for him to get home, I tried to change out of my pajamas but had to run to the bathroom to vomit. As I knelt over the toilet, I heard another voice, faint and indistinct, just outside the bathroom door. When Jack arrived, he rushed me to the hospital. The doctors diagnosed me with bacterial meningitis and explained how serious it was. If left untreated, it could cause permanent damage or even be fatal. The hallucinations, they said, were uncommon but not unheard of. They started me on antibiotics immediately and assured me I'd recover, though I'd need to stay for a few days. Jack stayed with me for several hours, but around 10 p.m. he left to get some rest before work the next day. The nurse told me to call her if I needed anything, and despite feeling like death, I fell asleep quickly. That night, I had a vivid dream. My ex-husband, Marcus, was sitting in a chair beside my hospital bed, looking down at me. His presence felt so real. He began saying terrible things about Jack, accusing him of being unworthy of me, and claiming he wanted to kill him. A shadow flickered behind him, stretching unnaturally across the walls as he leaned closer. "I should get rid of him," he whispered, his lips curling into a twisted smile. The room darkened, the air thick with something unseen but heavy, and then he left the room. I jolted awake, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. The room was dimly lit, and my head throbbed with pain. I glanced at the chair beside my bed. It was pulled up close, but empty. That chair had been against the wall when Jack left. My chest tightened as I tried to convince myself it was just a dream. The next morning, a nurse came in to check on me. I hesitated but told her about the unsettling dream I'd had. Her face grew serious. "That wasn't a dream," she said. "Your cousin David visited you last night." I froze. "I don't have a cousin named David," I said, my voice trembling. Her expression changed to one of concern. "Well, someone who said your cousin David was here late last night." My heart sank. David was Marcus's middle name. My mind raced as I tried to piece together what was real and what wasn't. Later that day, I called Jack to tell him what had happened. He was furious and concerned, promising to come back after work. In the meantime, I texted Marcus. "What were you thinking visiting me? How did you even know I was in the hospital?" I demanded. The message delivered, but Marcus didn't respond. Frustrated, I sent another. "I heard everything you said about Jack. "If you come near me again, I'm calling the police." Minutes later, he replied, denying the threats and claiming I must have been dreaming. I warned him to stay away, and he didn't reply again. The uncertainty of that week haunted me. Were the threats real or just hallucinations? I'll never know, but I've kept Marcus out of my life ever since. I once connected with a girl named Nikki on Tinder, and to this day we've remained close friends. From our very first conversation, she struck me as bold and adventurous. With a full sleeve of tattoos on her left arm, fiery red streaks running through her dark hair, and an undeniable confidence, she had a presence that was hard to ignore. Her profile mentioned a passion for fitness, and one photo stood out. A shot of her standing on the rooftop of an abandoned hospital, the city skyline stretching behind her. Curious, I asked her about the location. She explained that it was an old deserted hospital on the outskirts of town, a well-known spot for urban exploration. According to her, sneaking in was surprisingly easy, with only a single cop occasionally patrolling the empty parking lot. I was caught off guard when she casually suggested we meet there instead of opting for a more traditional first hangout. But the idea of exploring a forgotten building under the cover of night was far more intriguing than the usual dinner or drinks. So I thought, why not? The night came, and I picked her up at her place about 10 minutes away. During the 20-minute drive to the hospital, we hit it off, chatting and laughing about our lives and interests. Nikki had this natural charisma that made it easy to feel at ease with her, even though the destination had my nerves slightly on edge. When we arrived, Nikki directed me to park on a dead-end street, hidden behind a row of tall bushes. It was dark, and the isolation of the area only added to the suspense. From there, we had to walk about 5 minutes to the hospital grounds. She led the way confidently, hopping over a small barrier separating the road from the massive parking lot. We jogged across the open space until we reached a grassy patch near an entrance she claimed she always used. The entrance turned out to be a shattered basement window. Nikki told me to wear old clothes that could handle a little damage, and I was grateful for her advice as I climbed through, carefully avoiding the jagged edges. We turned on our phone flashlights to navigate the dark, eerie basement. Nikki seemed completely at home in the creepy environment, and I trusted her to guide us through. We climbed a staircase to the first floor, and I was starting to feel the weight of the eerie silence. The hospital was massive, and every step echoed ominously through the empty halls. Nikki chatted casually, her voice louder than I was comfortable with. I almost wanted to ask her to keep it down, paranoid that we'd draw unwanted attention. As we walked, a faint noise interrupted her. It sounded like a door creaking open or shutting down the corridor. Nikki stopped mid-sentence and whispered, "That's not normal." My heart rate spiked as we turned off our flashlights and stood still, listening intently. A sudden bang echoed much closer this time, sending adrenaline coursing through my veins. We scrambled silently, Nikki leading the way. In the chaos, I barely managed to keep up with her as we bolted up the stairs to a higher floor. Only when we were several levels up did we feel safe enough to speak again. "It's probably just other explorers," she tried to reassure me, though her voice betrayed some uncertainty. "But it's strange we didn't see any other flashlights." Suddenly, footsteps echoed from the stairwell we had just escaped. Someone was coming. Panic set in as we took off running again, navigating the labyrinthine hallways. Nikki's confidence seemed to waver as she admitted she wasn't sure where the sounds were coming from. Eventually, we found an outdoor area on a lower rooftop. The fresh air was a relief, but the sense of being followed loomed heavy. After catching our breath, Nikki guided us through a shattered window into what appeared to be the ceiling of a large room. Narrow wooden planks were stretched across the beams, forming a precarious path over a 10-foot drop. "Just follow me," she said, stepping carefully across the first plank. I hesitated, acutely aware that a single misstep could result in a nasty fall. We reached a wide beam where we could sit for a moment, legs dangling over the edge. It felt like the worst was behind us, until we heard faint footsteps below. As we shined our flashlights downward, the beam landed on a figure standing directly below us. He was deathly pale, his sunken eyes locked onto ours with an unnatural, frozen grin. His clothes, a black jacket, sweatpants, and a beanie, looked tattered and out of place, as if they belonged to another time. "Come on down," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow echoing through the empty halls. His hand lifted in a slow, deliberate wave, beckoning us forward. Nikki and I exchanged a terrified glance before quickly getting up and making our way back across the planks. We finally made it back to the stairwell and sprinted down, the sound of slamming doors and heavy footsteps hauntingly close behind us. It felt like a nightmare come to life. Once outside, we bolted across the parking lot to my car, locking the doors immediately. Breathless and shaken, we sat there in stunned silence for a moment before driving away. Nikki directed me to a Wendy's where we parked, got some food, and tried to calm down. We spent the next hour talking about the experience, processing what had just happened. That night forged a strange bond between us. For a few months, Nikki and I were romantically involved, but ultimately, we decided we were better off as friends. Neither of us ever returned to that hospital again.